Leopold Kohr was, in his life, a philosopher who favored the small over the big, the near over the far, the simple over the complex. And he also favored the personal over the corporate and the physical over the abstract, which is to say our whole agenda here at Nooga Radio. David Tulis, his big book, his most noted book is The Breakdown of Nations, that came out in 1957. He knew André Malraux, Hemingway, Orwell, covering the Spanish Civil War prior to World War II. And he's described as kind of an anarchist, but he's really not an anarchist in the bad sense. And he believes that we have a problem with size. And he says, for example, that he says that there seems to be only one cause behind all forms of social misery, and that's bigness. Oversimplified as this may seem, we shall find the idea more easily acceptable if we consider that bigness or oversize is really much more than just a social problem. It appears to be the one and only problem permeating all creation. And so he says that if the body of a people becomes diseased with the fever of aggression, brutality, collectivism, or massive idiocy, it is not because it has fallen victim to bad leadership or mental derangement. It is because, and here's where our argument comes in, because human beings, so charming as individuals or in small aggregations, have been welded into over-concentrated social units. And that's where war comes from. Think of the German Federated States becoming a nation under the Kaiser in the late 1800s, and then becoming the great war power of World War I and World War II, the big bad guy. We're looking at the idea of independent city-states and thinking, Sam Spade and I, that Chattanooga has a prospect in this direction. What can we do to understand that, and what can we do to work in terms of it? And in this part of our interview, we're going to look and see at we've seen the problems of why a devolution, a decentralization has to come, and these we could say are bad. Would we equalize these to Sam, to bad headlines, bad news? Is that the coming meltdown? Is that good headlines or bad headlines?
I think that's an accurate headline. I don't know whether that means it's good or bad, but I believe it is unfortunately accurate.
Okay, so it's bad news though, but accurate.
Yes,
in the meltdown.
I believe, by the way, that you mentioned here for the first time in our show a statement or a term that's very relevant, and I want to talk just a bit about it. And that is the term of city-state. You know, most people, when they hear that, they think of ancient Greece. And what we're really talking about is a situation in which the dominant political power is in a small city with the surrounding country that supports that city. And I just would like to throw out
surrounding countryside,
yes,
not a
nation. Not in the nation again. If it's it depends on what you define as nation. The dominant polity, the organization that is the political function in the area, and I just want to mention that even though you may think that's an ancient concept and therefore discardable, that in fact today many of what we call the most successful political entities are city-states. Let me point out that Singapore is a city-state, and even some of the larger nations that you don't normally think of. If you think about it a little bit, you'll realize that the UK is a city-state. There is London, which is the city in the UK, and the rest of the country pretty much follows and exists to support London. The same is true of Japan, in which you have Tokyo as the city-state. Now, these are not on the size of the city-state that we're talking about for Singapore or for Chattanooga, but it's still an example of this kind of entity that exists right now in modern days in very, very successful structures.
Well, think of Dubai, which in 1985 was a haven for fishermen and I guess pirates, and with about 400,000 people. But now it has 2 million people or more, and it has the largest port and largest airport and financial center in the Middle East. It is something of what we're talking about. And if we have, see, the question I think, Bob, is the bad news that's coming out of Washington against itself. It'll be about how Washington can't do this, it can't do that anymore. Its creditors are clamoring. Its paper is going into decline. Inflation is roaring because the bank is trying to help. And so there's increasing discredit against Washington, and all of its wonderful blessings are grown to be hated. And so on the left side of our chart, which I'm holding up here for our YouTube viewer, if you want to see my notes, it's on actually the right side of this piece of paper, my show notes, 2 columns. One is devolution, the bad things that are going to happen to the centralized structure, the monoculture of cartel capitalism, crony capitalism. That's you might see the bad news coming out of that, the demise of that system. And on the right side, we have the rebuilding phase, and that's what I think we want to look at right now. Sam Spade, is this good side. But so just to summarize the left side, the problem, you might say the bad headlines, the shocker headlines, would be debt crisis and implosion of purpose among agencies and cartel holders, license holders from the national government who can't do their jobs anymore, loss of confidence of the people, hatred and contempt of the national power, blowback, militarization. That would be a kind of warfare or quasi-warfare among peoples in this country, the ending of services, and the localization of decisions. Again, people view that in a way as bad news. We're going to have to decide that here. We're going to have to raise money to repair this highway here. So those are kind of bad headlines. But on the other side, Bob, how would you start the good news? In other words, the rebuilding side for Chattanooga, for even Hamilton County, and place areas beyond where they become self-sustaining, cohering, coalescing with a kind of internal identity that's not really political anymore, is it? It's not necessarily a political coherence and cohesion among peoples living here.
Well, it's very much it's an economic as well as political cohesion, because you're dealing with people that you know every day economically, and they deal with you in return. The transaction is a two-way transaction. You get something for what you produce and vice versa, as opposed to the centralized national structure right now where you send money off to Washington. You have no idea what's coming back to you, if it comes back to you. And so there's a complete disconnect. The advantage of having a small political entity is that entity is now responsive to the needs of the population. And so it can be innovative, it can be flexible, it can evolve and function. And that's something that's not going on at the national level. All we see is a sclerosis in which one group who wants to get power is trying to smash another group that wants to get power. And neither of them is trying to help out the rest of the country, and frankly doesn't even know how to help out the rest of the country because they are so isolated from it.
Right. So there is this sense of the death of politics in a way. Especially, we'll see the death of politics more and more as the percentage of discretionary spending in the federal budget comes down from, I think, about 11 or 12% now to down to 5%, 3%, 2%. And when all politics is about that last 2% of the budget, we realize we have the death of politics as our savior. And so that's why I'm asking whether in your mind, the coming city-state that would be Chattanooga and the region would be maybe more apolitical. Politics, after all, is simply the argument over the laws. That's what politics is. What are the laws? How is the compulsion biblically we would call the civil magistrate, how is the power of compulsion and coercion and the death penalty, how is that to be applied? Is it to be broadly exercised as it is now, or very, very narrowly exercised as probably will come, I would say, in the future in this region?
It's much tougher for a small administration in a small city like Chattanooga to control everything people do. It becomes much easier when you have a large amount of concentrated power in a central location. So as soon as this crisis hits, the people that are running Chattanooga are suddenly going to be in a position where the monetary authority that came to them and gave them the ability to make decisions is gone. The only way they're going to be able to survive is to come to the people of the Chattanooga and build a consensus and get their cooperation. Let me take, for instance, the issue of crime. That's going to become a serious problem when the economy
private
crime.
As opposed to state crime.
Private crime, yes. That's going to become a serious problem. If dollar stops being worth anything, if the EBT cards stop flowing, if all of the federal support disappears, local crime is going to be a very serious problem. There's just not enough police to try and control it. And the only solution is for the police to go out to the community, begin to organize community watch groups, and I do mean, if necessary, armed community watch groups, and provide the coordination for that. The people who are pro-First Amendment don't think about the fact that part of the First Amendment
says... the Second Amendment?
The Second Amendment, forgive me. don't think about the fact that it says a regulated militia. That word regulated, in spite of the fact that the anti-gun people want to use it to eliminate guns altogether, is important. And what it means is that the survival and the strength of a society in conflict and in facing violence comes not from the fact that we own a gun, but that we cooperate together collectively to use those firearms for the common good. That's the regulation. And that's something that the police department and the city is going to realize that they are going to have to work with to try and organize and coordinate that.
Well, this is what we want to talk about, Sam Spade, in these next few minutes. We do thank you for giving us a couple minutes of your time. You are a listener here at Nooga Radio, and we're looking on the right-hand column of my chart here, holding up this chart for the YouTube and Facebook viewer. We have the left side, which we call devolution, the bad news, the scary headlines about the coming crisis in the national power and the national credit-based economy. And on the right side is the rebuilding side, and we've already mentioned the idea of local liquidity, local capital, with local mediums of exchange that will come back. Chattanooga used to have 5 or 6 circulating money systems back in the 19th century. And so in rebuilding, we're going to have a loss of easy credit. We're going to have a loss of central banking that we all prosper from, even though we're being ruined by it. We have an opportunity with the loss of that system, which means what, Sam Spade? How is there good news in the loss of that central authority?
Well, one of the aspects of the good news is that we are all going to suddenly realize we have to produce something of value to trade for the things we need in life. You know, we can't simply dance through a bureaucratic game of some sort. We can't simply satisfy forms and get money from the government. We need to go to another individual in our community or individuals and give them something they want in return for what they have that we want. It means we are suddenly forced to think about how can I become a productive citizen? How can I find something, whether it's growing vegetables in my own garden or developing carpentry skills to go out and repair a neighbor's house? How can
running a 3D printer in a small factory in your garage?
Exactly. Figure out how to start producing something with a 3D printer or some other technology right there in my own house. It suddenly forces all of us to become entrepreneurs. And a society full of entrepreneurs is far more effective and innovative and productive than a society in a straitjacket dictated by a bureaucratic government in Washington.
Well, what else would you say would be on the rebuilding column, Sam Spade? How are we going to be taking advantage of the coming crisis? What on the other side of that crisis? How are we going to make ourselves better? What can my listener do, or what will he be doing theoretically to help build this self-directed, self-determining Chattanooga region city-state?
Well, I think one of the things that he has to do right now, probably the most important thing he has to do, is recognize that the change is coming and ask himself, how can I personally transition into a situation where I can take advantage of this new world? How can I do this for my wife and my family? What can I set aside as a method by which I could begin to contribute something to community that it needs to give me back money? You mentioned one in particular of 3D printing. Now is the time to start to learn about 3D printing. If you think that is the sort of area that you might want to go into, now is the time to begin to learn about carpentry. If you think that is the backup that you want to go into, begin to think now about what it is that you can supply, whether it's learning to put in a vegetable garden because you have a very large piece of land sitting there in your backyard, currently covered with grass that's worthless. Learn now how to start growing vegetables by beginning to grow vegetables. Become proactive now while you have a chance.
What advantages, Sam Spade, does Chattanooga have that would make this process of self-realization and self-determination easier? What are some strengths that you see among people in the area, or aspects of either geography or natural resources?
Well, the geography, of course, is quite significant in that we're at several major crossroads from other large metropolitan areas that will themselves try to become city-states and survive in some city-state sense. We have Nashville, we have Atlanta, we have Knoxville, and of course we have the Chattanooga River, which represents a major thoroughfare as well, so that if gas becomes too expensive to use for more than a minimum amount Commerce, we have a major source of commerce right there.
So the Tennessee River effectively renames itself the Chattanooga River while it passes through our particular region. Is that? I guess Chattanooga will claim the authority to rename rivers for its own benefit, right?
I don't know about that, but it certainly we are at the nexus of several different trade routes, and that will help us in terms of trying to establish commerce.
Well, there are three quick points I'd want to make on this point, Sam Spade, about the advantages of Chattanooga. As I try to diagram this question out, and in that chart, there's a separate chart. You have the weak things in Chattanooga, why there are things that are built in because we're subject to national economy that are part of our weaknesses and our inabilities. But on the right side, the strong areas, I would say geography is one, and then I would say a culture of innovation, and we can see some of that downtown, even supported by Mayor Andy Burke. A progressive Democrat. He wants to be part of that. He sees that as an advantage. And also the fact that we don't kill babies in Chattanooga. There's a blessing that comes there with the end of the baby killing from the closure of the Chattanooga Women's Clinic, and the fact there are 700 churches where the Word of God is partly preached, and there always on the individual. The individual should look out for others. The individual in this church of 700 should care for others, die to himself. He should love God. He should be submissive to the needs of other people. So that's very capital oriented. That's a capital ethic, capital oriented, capital creating ethic, I would suggest.
Yes, it certainly is. In fact, one of the nature of churches, as well as other group organizations, is that it enables you to develop those sorts of networks that are exactly what I just talked about when I said I can gain access to the mayor by going through my good friend David, who can go through his good friend Mr. Crockett, who will get to the mayor with a message.
Mr. Crockett did not win the election, I'm sad to say, and Andy Burke won't return my call, so we'll have to wait until his term is over.
Well, nonetheless, I am sure that the old 6 degrees of freedom thing, in which the argument is that everybody knows everybody in the world if you go through 6 different people to get there. I don't know how valid that is for the world, but I do know when it comes to Chattanooga, because we are a community of small networks like churches, like other social groups, like the posse that we have in the morning that we go to.
That's Panera Posse, by the way.
That's correct. We wind up knowing so many people on a personal level. It's one thing if you're somebody high up in an administration to get an email or a letter saying, we think this is a good idea and do this. It's an entirely different thing when somebody that you know personally and have some respect for calls you up and says, listen, I think you should listen to this subject. That's why small organizations like you have on the scale of a city of Chattanooga, small administrations are so much more effective in terms of what they're able to do because they can judge the value of the source that's coming to them.
Well, let me ask you about a problem. Regionalism, as is currently contemplated, I think is not a good idea because it just envisions separating people from government. You don't have county government anymore. You don't have city government. You have regional government. So I think in the current paradigm with commercial government and these state and local organizations, regionalism is not good because it separates and removes and makes more remote the authority structure from the people. But in the coming cataclysm, what then? We'll have regionalism, Sam Spade. Will that regionalism be any better than the proposed regionalism of today?
I'm not sure I agree with your first statement about regionalism. The reason, though, that I believe that coming regionalism will be so much better than prior regionalisms, as an example, the feudal period in Europe, which was, again, composed of city-states, was that nowadays communications exist through the internet and through other electronic means that unites us intellectually across political spectrum. So that if you have a nation that breaks into city-states, as may happen during the coming crisis, that doesn't mean the nation ceases to exist as an organization. It means that now communications of ideas and thoughts and technologies will still take place all across the nation.
Will the future of the Chattanooga region, the future hoped for independent city-state, Sam Spade, will it be more in the voluntarist direction or more in the use of force direction?
I think the answer probably depends on where you are. One of the advantages of a political structure which consists of many small regions is that you will have different ways of in conducting politics in those different regions. They will compete with each other. Those that are successful will prosper. Those that are not will realize they have to change and will do so.
And the ones that are successful probably will have less use of force, less compulsion.
Yes. And the ones that are not successful, maybe because they are too heavily rely on force and compulsion, will be forced to change because they will fail.
Sam Spade, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
This is David Tulis. We've been talking with Sam Spade here on the David Tulis program. I think this discussion has been very, very enlightening and very encouraging. I hope you think so too. Subscribe to Nooganomics.com, my website. That's Nooganomics.com, the website for the man who matters. Not popular, and that's because we go into the deep state issues and the deep free market prospects here in the Chattanooga area, Chattanooga and beyond. Local economy and free markets. David Tulis, Nooga Radio.
Nooga Radio, AM 1240, 92.7 FM.